Well, it's time to begin our class. What did he say? You hush. I think he said, are you standing? It's great to be here. We appreciate your presence. Joy finished up last week. Joy, thank you for an excellent class. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. We're going to start a study tonight of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So tonight I'll introduce it, Lord willing, and then we'll get into it verse by verse, either next week or week after next. It just depends on how long the introduction goes. But we certainly appreciate the presence of each one. I want to thank you for all the cards, visits, phone calls, money, gift cards that you've done for Betty while she's been incarcerated. She got one sympathy card. She said, I didn't die, did I? But we really do appreciate it. Your generosity has been gracious, and we appreciate it very much. And I'll tell you what, when things like this happen, you really realize the benefit of prayer. Everybody's been praying for her, and we appreciate it. People I don't know that I get emails from that we're praying for Betty and for you, and they're praying that she'll get well and get back to cooking for me, because they know my kind of cooking is not very good. I did fix some beanie weenies, though. Yeah, that's what I say. But thank you so much. We do appreciate it. If you have an opportunity, read 1 Thessalonians at least once a week. You ought to read it once a day if you can. I don't think some might do that, but that's not a lot of reading, really. It's a short book. Do you think sometimes we let books, if they're short, kind of go unnoticed? As if maybe, like one chapter books. Sometimes we don't know much about them. Or I know the first time I taught the book of Philemon over to school, I asked a student, they only had one, get me 5 sermons out of Philemon. He said, can you get 5 sermons out of Philemon? I said, you're fixing to find out. And he did. Now I guarantee you could do a lot more, but sometimes they go unnoticed. 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians are 2 of those books that a lot of times if you ask questions about them, you'll get very few answers. People just don't study them. They don't read them, and they just don't look at it, think about it. And I'm going to think, hopefully after we finish, in particular these 2 books, you'll look back and say, man, those books have really blessed my life. And every book that a preacher I know studies is his favorite book. Right now, 1 Thessalonians is my favorite book of the Bible. When we get to 2 Thessalonians, I'm sure that'll become my favorite. But right now, after reading the book over and over again and looking at the great lessons that's in it, I think, man, I've been needing this for a long time. I wish I'd have done this a lot sooner. When you think about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, these are some of the earliest books that the Apostle Paul wrote. Somewhere around 52, 53, you have covered the 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And so it was written relatively early in his work. The church was established on his 2nd missionary journey, and Timothy and Silas were very instrumental in that. Thessalonica, at that time when Paul lived, was the chief city of Macedonia. It was about 100 miles west of Philippi. Philippi and this area of Thessalonica had, it seems like a pretty good work going. Matter of fact, Paul says when he went to Thessalonica, he worked with his own hands, but the church at Philippi was the only one that assisted him. So the church at Philippi assisted Paul in his work at Thessalonica. So that says something about the kind of relationship that they enjoyed. It's on the Aegean Sea, and when you look at the location of Thessalonica, you immediately just say to yourself, well, this had to be a really rich area because it was close to the Aegean Sea, and, of course, the trail that led to Rome was through there. And when you look at all the things about that, it was just set in the perfect location for physical prosperity. Now, along with that, like Corinth, comes problems because it brings a lot of people in. And when it brings a lot of people in, they bring their baggage with them. And so they're going to bring ideas and things that's going to happen. But it also opens up a door of opportunity for evangelism. Because if you got a lot of corruption and sin, guess what? You need evangelism. You need people being taught. And so Paul's going to take advantage of that opportunity. It was founded around 315 BC by Cassandra, the king of Macedon. And Cassandra named the city after his wife, Thessalonica. And so you can see a lot of things going on. The daughter of Philip II of Macedon. And this also was the city of was named after, of course, Alexander or Philippi. The famous East-West Highway, the Ignition Way, was there, so it connected a lot of things together. As I mentioned, the church at Thessalonica was established on Paul's second missionary, and the church was founded there and made up mostly of Gentiles. And when you look at this, it becomes very important. To kind of get some background information, turn to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. And you'll see the background material of the church at Thessalonica. Verse number 1 says that when they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and they came to Thessalonica, there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now, what was Paul's customary thing to do when there were synagogues where he went? He took advantage of it, didn't he? He'd go into the synagogue and teach. And a lot of good was done. He made some enemies by doing that, but a lot of good was done by his work that he did there. But when he goes into these areas, he's got a teaching audience already available for him. I remember when we went on a Rise to Truth, we went on a station that was owned and operated by a Baptist. And it was just saturated with one denominational program after another till on with a Rise to Truth on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2 to 3 where you could call in and answer questions. Well, we were told we're getting petitions to get you off the air. A couple of the denominational churches band together and told Al Morris, the owner of the station at that time, we're going off the air. As long as you leave those guys on Tuesday and Thursday, we're off. So they dropped 3 programs. We picked up the time slots. So they thought, well, what's going on? So we bought their time slots. So we had 3 programs going instead of the Tuesday and Thursday. We had some other ones. Then we switched them back and went back to the 2 and 3 at time for financial reasons to help with that. But Al told them, he said, well, they paid their bills. They do what's right by, and if you fool with us, they'll be the only religious program on this station. But we were asked, and I thought a good question, why would you go in a denominational station to preach the gospel the way and the things that you're doing for an audience? See, we had an audience provided for us, and it was similar to Paul's going into a synagogue where he knew that a lot of those people were not going to agree with what he taught, but he was going to give them a discourse. He would give them back and forth to talk and to deal with these issues. When you have that which is right, truth, you have no reason to fear some doctrinal position that someone may advocate. If you know what the truth is, you'll be able to refute that. And so Paul goes in to the synagogue, and so Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them for 3 Sabbaths. Now look what he did. He reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. Now the idea of reasoning here is to have a Bible study, a discourse. They could ask a question. They could make a comment. They could disagree. And he would deal with those kind of things as they came up. And so they would do that. And so he goes to the synagogue and he reasoned with them. Now, what was the standard they reasoned out of? The Scriptures. So many times when you're discussing spiritual matters with people, it's not about the Scriptures, it's I think, I feel, my uncle said, our preacher believes. And don't ever go to the Bible. One guy said to Wesley and Howard as they were studying with them, a preacher in our area here, I don't know much about the Bible, I just know what the Spirit tells me. Well, that's his way of saying he didn't know nothing about the Bible. And that was obvious, of course, but the Spirit wasn't telling him nothing either, because the Spirit's not going to tell him something that the Bible does not advocate, if he had the real Spirit talking to him. But of course, he did not. But notice they reasoned out of the Scriptures. They opened the Scriptures alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen from the dead, and that the Jews the Jesus that I preach unto you is Christ. Well, that's what the center of discussion was. Now, we'll talk a little later, we'll point out by way of introduction. In every chapter, at the end of every chapter of 1 Thessalonians, the second coming of Christ is mentioned. And I'll read a statement when I get there about that a man wrote and talked about how that the church has lost sight of the return of Christ, and because of that, a lot of things are going to the side that should be being done. And we don't do them, and a lot of reasons why we don't. We're not anticipating that Christ is coming. But if that's ever in our attention and our foresight, then it's going to make a big difference. If I think Christ is going to come in the next few minutes, how am I going to be living? If I think he's not coming tonight, not tomorrow, next month, or next year, then how am I going to be living? And you know, Ecclesiastes says because sin is not executed speedily, that we think we're getting away with it. And so sometimes because judgment isn't in our thinking imminent, we just let it fly by. We don't get serious about what we're doing. And so Paul, in writing to Titus and other passages, talked about ever looking, earnestly, steadfastly looking for the appearing of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ. It becomes important to keep the proper perspective and to stay focused, and that's not always easy to do, but it's always important and must be done if we're going to be pleasing. So he said that, notice he opened the Scriptures. He is alleging, teaching from the Scriptures, that Christ had to suffer and that he would rise again from the dead. One in the religious world, first century, would have a problem with a resurrection from the dead, would they? Or would they? Religious people, the Sadducees, did not believe in resurrection. And that is sad, you see, isn't it? I mean, no resurrection? What's going on? And so he talked about the resurrection from the dead, and that Jesus, whom I preach, is the Christ. He's the one that they've been looking for, the Christos, all the time, the Messiah that Isaiah talked about and other prophets talked about. This is Jesus, the Jesus that Paul was preaching. And so he said, this is the one I preach unto you. Some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. And so here's already a success story having its beginning in Thessalonica. So there's a good background right off the bat as to the way things are going. Now things are going to get rough because it don't matter how well you may do and how great you may do at a time, Satan's on his way. I mean, he's going to do what he can. It's not going to go just everything the way you want it to go. Things are going to get tough, as we're going to see. And the church at Thessalonica was established, when it was established there, was established in a hotbed that's going to become a hotbed for persecution. So remaining faithful to God, in spite of what's going on, is going to be difficult. And some of them, of course, will do that. But some of them believe, that is, they gave way to what Paul taught, and Silas, and the devout Greeks, a great multitude, and of the women not a few, but the Jews. It seemed like the Jews were always a thorn in the flesh of that which is right. You would think they would be your best friend if you were trying to teach Christ, the Messiah. Wouldn't you? I mean, they're God's elect, chosen people under the Old Testament law that he's brought along, and over and over again got out of trouble. And you would think if there's anyone in the world that would be up in arms in a joyful way about Jesus Christ and being the Messiah, it'd be the Jews. But the Jews, which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and they gathered a company, and they set the whole city on an uproar. You don't think trouble is coming? He set the whole city. Now, you know, they're going to turn around and say, Paul and the disciples turned the world upside down. They're the ones that turned it into an uproar. They're the ones. You remember back in the Old Testament, Elijah is a troublemaker. Well, the real troublemaker was the ones that said Elijah's a troublemaker. He's not a troublemaker. They're the troublemaker. You know, sometimes we think the problem's with someone else. And we look in the mirror and we say, no, the problem's me. I'm at fault, or I need to do better, or whatever. But here they said, Paul, as they'll say later, is a troublemaker. It's turned the world upside down. And here they gather all this company together. And the scripture says they set the whole city on an uproar, and they assaulted the house of Jason, and they sought to bring them out to the people. And when they found not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, these have turned the world upside down and are come hither also. Well, again, the problem wasn't the apostles or Jason or no one else that taught the truth. The problem was them. The problem was the Jews. And they're trying to be troublemakers. But I want you to notice what they did. When the Jews that believed not, what did they do? The ones that believed not said idly by and do nothing. Have you noticed how Satan's children are always working? They don't sit back and wait for somebody else to do it. They get involved. They get busy. And they will attack the truth. Satan always has, and he will. And so here's his workers, and what are they doing? They're attacked. They move. They move. Now, Noah moved with godly fear, and that's how we ought to be moved. But they moved in an envy way and hated the church and hated Paul and hated Christ and hated anything that truth stood for. And yet they would be the first to raise their hand and say, we're God's chosen people. We got it made. You know, we even have people today that are not Jews that will say, don't mess with the people in Palestine. Those are God's chosen people. God's chosen people in the Old Testament has never been just somebody by nationality. Did you know that? God's chosen people were people that did what God taught. That was God's chosen people, always has been. You know, as early as the book of Deuteronomy, Moses said, I'll set before you good and evil. Choose the good and live. Choose the bad and you'll reap the consequences of it. And today, and under New Testament Christianity in Romans 2, a Jew is not one that's outwardly of the flesh, but one that's inward. So we're spiritual Jews if we've obeyed the gospel and become citizens in God's kingdom. But when you look at the words, and pay attention as you're reading Acts or if you're reading Thessalonians or whatever you're doing, when you read things like that, like the word moved, set a city in an uproar, these are people that are actively engaged in error, but what they believe. And we need a little bit of zeal in the Lord's church to be willing to stand and even if we have to, fight for what we believe. Instead of just passively sitting by and doing nothing and saying, well, we can't do that. There's people that don't think you should ever defend truth or stand for it, but that's not the case. We should stand for that which is right. And so they said, these guys have come, they've turned the world upside down, and not only that, they've come here to do the same thing. Whom Jason hath received, and these all do, contrary to the decree of Caesar, saying, there's another king, and that's Jesus. Well, I got news for them. Jesus never intended to be the kind of king they were trying to make him anyway. They wanted him an earthly king. That's who they were looking for. He didn't fit their bill, and so they changed. But nonetheless, he wasn't trying to get Caesar's job. He's the one that gave Caesar his job. The authorities that be are given from the higher power of God and ought to follow God's will. They don't, but they should. But this is just subterfuge. More lies to do what? Why would they say that? He says he's going to be king. They knew he wasn't. Yeah, exactly. It was a lie to try to stir up more people.
What's interesting is they employed community organizers in verse 5.
Yes, they did. Yeah, they hired people of the baser sort to elude people. Ken?
It's almost, they say there's nothing new under the sun. And it's almost a foreshadowing of the same things that you can read says they were upsetting the world. The world, not just Thessalonica.
Right.
They were being accused of upsetting the world. Wow. That's impressive. You know, and that they were shouting it. I took issue with an individual once before. I said, just because you talk loud and talk fast, don't make you right.
That's right. Exactly. So much of this, when you read it, you say, that's like reading in the morning's newspaper. Or we're going through the same situations in the Lord's church. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And so here they were. And so when he said they couldn't find them, they got Jason and did what they did to him. And they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. And when they had taken, verse 9, security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. And the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who coming thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. And these that were more noble than those in Thessalonica. I have a little fun out of the students when I'm teaching this. I have them read first the Thessalonians. And I say, how can you be more noble? Of course, they know. And it says Berea was more noble than those Thessalonica. He's not talking about the church. He's not saying the church in Berea was more acceptable than the church in Thessalonica. He's saying the people of Berea were more noble than the people of Thessalonica. Do what? Yeah. The church at Thessalonica, you're not going to find a congregation have more good things said about them in such a powerful way than they had said about them. And when I have them read that, they kind of dumbfounded because we think church, the people in the church at Berea was more noble than the people in the church at Thessalonica, and that's not. They're talking about the two areas. The area was more receptive. So you know the Jews, since Berea is more acceptable than Thessalonica, guess what the Jews in Berea or Thessalonica did? They went to Berea. They went right where Paul was. Because, again, they don't quit. They don't quit. Satan's children don't quit. They're going to fight on and on and on. And if you move out of town and you go to some other town, you'll find Satan there too. Jack was teaching Job, and guess what? When the children of God assembled together before God, who do you think showed up? Satan did. He don't care to come to services. If he can cause some trouble, he'll be glad to come. But he'll be there. He will do that. And so Acts 17 sets somewhat a good background for this. And so those that believed consorted with Paul and Silas and the devout Greeks and so on. And then 1 Thessalonians 1:9, for they themselves show of us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. Those Jews, or Gentiles rather, that were at Thessalonica turned away from idols and turned to serve the living God. And so again, you see a great progress being made. And so Paul's success in converting the Gentiles because of envy moved the Jews to anger. That's crazy, but it happened. I mean, you think everybody would be rejoicing. People are obeying the gospel and becoming better and so forth, and that's just not what happens. And so in Acts 18:11, he continued there 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. And so while in the last city he wrote the letters to the Thessalonians following the report that he received from Timothy. In 1 Thessalonians 3, we won't read these verses, 1 through 8, talks about that. Now I want to spend some time now, by way of introduction, talking about Paul's purpose in writing 1 Thessalonians and then his commendation of them. And when we get into these, especially the commendations, think about them. And think about as they apply to this congregation and as they apply to you individually and to me. And I think when we get through, we're going to say, man, Wesley said he really got so much encouragement out of reading the book of Revelation and studying it. I do 1 Thessalonians. Same thing with 1 Thessalonians. When you read what Paul says about commending them and that would be applicable to us if we're doing the same thing, then that's very encouraging. God is on our side, right? And if he be for us, who can be against us? All right, let's think about some of the purposes. Ken, read 2:14. 1 Thessalonians 2:14 for us. Ken's got a good voice. We can hear him.
For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea. For you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews.
You know, think of that. This is one of the purposes of his writing, the church in the midst of persecution. They needed to be encouraged. They were being persecuted. A lot of people, when they're being persecuted, quit. We quit God. We quit the church. We quit what we really need. Why would we quit God? Because we're being persecuted by the children of the devil. We should turn more to God and rely on him. And so Paul realizes the need for encouragement. We don't do that sometimes. We just fight the issues, or we do whatever we got to do, and we don't think about, what about encouraging? What can encouragement do to a group of people that are discouraged? What can it happen? It can make us better, give us the courage and strength that we need. And so you have Paul in 2:14 encouraging the church in the midst of persecution, and that's one of the purposes for writing this. And so whatever you and I go through at this moment is not as serious as what they were going through physically, I don't think. I mean, literally being persecuted in their houses, being killed, spouses being killed before the eyes of the other spouse, children being mutilated. I mean, all kinds of crazy things, serious stuff. I mean, they didn't smack you on the wrist for being a Christian. They put you in jail or killed you. And so it was serious. And so they need some encouragement. So when you need encouragement, read 1 Thessalonians. Read 1 Thessalonians. Because you may not get the encouragement from me. Or I might not get the encouragement from you at the time. And it may not be because we don't care, we just don't think about it or don't do it. But Paul, in reading the pages of inspiration, encourages us that whatever we face, God's on our side, as Ken just read for us. Now, we won't read verses 1 to 10 of chapter 2, but it is to defend his conduct while against slanderous charges. There were all kinds of accusations made against Paul. And you know, you got people that say, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. And so he had insurmountable odds against him. And as Mike said, they didn't care to pay you to lie on Paul or on the apostles. They would pay you good money. You just go out and lie. I remember an attorney, I was told, came to Dad's house and asked him if he had testified about a wreck Dad didn't see. He said, you'll never want for anything else the rest of your life. And Dad and Mom wouldn't do that. They would not do that. But some people would have. With $1 or whatever, they would have done that. But these people would find people that would make all kinds of slanderous charges. They did against Jesus, didn't they? So we shouldn't suspect that it would be different with us. So he defends his conduct while there against these slanderous charges that are being made. And that was important. Because if they destroy him, they destroy his apostleship. See, and that's what they're out to do. It's not just about Paul, and he understood that. It's not about him or who he is. It's what he's standing for. And that's what they hated. And he could have changed that by giving in, and he wouldn't do that. All right? Then number 3, to assure them of his love for them. And his desire to see them, and his delight at Timothy's report. Chapter 2, verses 17 to 20, and chapter 3, verses 6 through 8. We'll get there, and we'll study those in context, but we're just looking now in an overall view of the purpose of the writing of 1 Thessalonians. And so would it not be encouraging when you're reading from a letter from a guy that says and proves his love for you? And you know he's acting out of love. So he loves you. To assure them of his love for them, He had a great desire to see them, and his delight at Timothy when he brought a good report about the church at Thessalonica and how well they were doing in the face of so much opposition. So how encouraging could it be to know that the same guys that we're reading about in the New Testament relative to these churches had the same mind for us, because who's behind their message? God's behind their message. So this is God really demonstrating through Paul, a man, his love for them. And he's willing to stand for them. And he's using Paul as that stick or that encouragement for a group of people that needed that encouragement. Another thing he did in chapter 4, verses 1 to 8, he warned them against the sins of the flesh that had been so common among the heathen. Idolatry was and it had been running rampant. Remember in 1 Thessalonians 1, he's going to say, you turn to God from your idols. Idols, you know what an idol would allow the people that worship them to do? Anything they wanted to. Franklin Kemp used to say, if you're going to make an idol, make one you like. And just fix it up to where you can do whatever you want to do. And that's what they did. An idol, just anything goes. They had turned from that, and Paul is warning them, don't turn back. The lusts of the flesh are still strong. And you've got to say no to sin and to the lust of the flesh. If there wasn't any temptation, I heard someone say, well, I used to be an alcoholic, but when I became a Christian, I never was tempted again. I wish God would have given me that good temptation to take away. He doesn't take away our temptation because we become Christians. Sometimes it may even get what we would say stronger, the temptations would, because now that which we've just commonly given into, we can't do anymore. I mean, when you was raised a heathen like I was, old habits are hard to break. And so you do stuff and you give it up. And you turn away from it, and after a while, if you're not careful, you find yourself kind of going back into what you got out of. And it wasn't no better now than it, or wouldn't be any better now than it was when we got out of it. It still destroys. Sin destroys and will ruin our lives. And so Paul is warning them against the sins and lusts of the flesh that they had so much been involved in and had been so much a part of their lives. No doubt that was one of the problems the Jews had. The Jews had been under Judaism for a long time. They come out of Judaism, and how long did it take some of them before they went back into it? Not very long. First Galatians 1, I marvel that you're so soon, quickly being removed away from the gospel back to Judaism. I marvel. It's amazing. But that's what happens sometimes. And if we're not warned and encouraged, we'll go back into that kind of stuff if we're not careful. Then he wants to writes the letter to rebuke idleness on the part of some. Now, he had a lot to say about the second coming, and they had a misunderstanding. Ken, read 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 10 to 12 for me. 2 Thessalonians 3, verses 10 through 12.
For even when we were with you, you used to give you this order. If anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. For we hear that some among you are leading an undisciplined life, doing no work at all, but acting like busybodies. Now such persons we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus Christ to work in quiet fashion and eat their own bread.
Jesus is going to come. We're looking for him to come, so we're not going to do anything. We're just going to wait for him. Well, you've got to be busy, and so some of them became idle. Now, the Bible doesn't say this, but it's a biblical principle. Idleness is a devil's workshop. If you don't busy yourself doing the will of God, you will busy yourself doing something. And you know what's left. So if you busy yourself doing the Word of God, that's fine. But they you can take a good biblical principle and apply it so much across the board that you miss the point of the principle. We ought to always look for Jesus, but we ought to be working every day doing what we can till he comes, and be looking for him at any moment. He will come, and he'll come as a thief in the night. Then this is, I thought, fascinating in looking at this, and you read it over and over again in 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18. But he wrote the letter to comfort the bereaved. He wrote the letter to comfort the bereaved. And everybody finds him or herself sometimes in a state of bereavement. And sometimes it seems like it's more than we can bear. And Paul writes this letter to comfort brethren that are bereaved. And I find comfort in that and how important that is. To exhort them to be watchful in view of Christ's return, chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And to encourage brotherly concern, faithfulness, unselfishness in our service while we're waiting patiently. So we wait, we look, we long, and we watch for his return. But in doing that, we want to encourage the brethren. We want to be faithful, be unselfish, serving while waiting patiently for him to come. And that is so important for us to do that. Now, that's just some of the things I got on the purpose of his writing 1 Thessalonians. Now, that's a lot covered in 8 points that can really bless your life and mine if we'll focus on it. If we'll really think about what he's saying here to them, make application to us, then we can really be blessed for that. Now, let's just go over in the next few minutes some of Paul's commendation of them. When Jesus wrote through John the 7 churches of Asia, what did he always do if he could? He complimented, he commended them. That's a lesson we need to learn. We all enjoy compliments. When someone comes out and hugs your neck and tells you, say, you're the best preacher in the world, makes you feel good. It's a lie, but it makes you feel good. We tell our students, whatever you're told at the back door, put in can number 5. But anyway, people mean well when they make statements, appreciate the lesson, that kind of thing. And we appreciate that. And it makes you feel good. And God, when he can, without lying, would always commend people. And so he commends them for their acceptance and practice of the gospel. We'll see that in chapter 1, verses 1 through 10. He commends them for their acceptance and practice of the gospel. In verse 8, for their work and patience. He appreciates what they do. Now, not all of them had the same capabilities. How much is God's appreciation for the one talented man that uses his talents? Just as much as it can be. Just as much as the 2 or the 5. You're not blessed greater because you're a 2 talented person or 5. You're blessed the same from God if you use them. The one talented man wasn't condemned because he just had one. If he'd have used it, he'd have ended up having more than one, but he was condemned because he didn't use it. And then number 3, for their genuine Christian character as an example to every person. If we'd have lived in the first century, we would have heard about the church at Thessalonica. They didn't talk the talk, they done the walking. He'll commend them for that. And what a blessing is that. All right, let's stop there. We'll take up these. I got 10 of them. We'll finish them, get into the book verses of the chapter 1 next week. But any questions or comments? I've rattled on, so I'll give you a chance if you want to. Any questions or comments? All right, let's look at another one. In verse 8 and chapter 3 and verse 6, he commends them for their faith. They had great faith. And I really like this one. Chapter 1, verse 8, for their evangelistic zeal. It's hard to have evangelistic zeal in the face of persecution. It's hard to go up and knock on that next door knowing you're going to get cursed out or run off or shot or whatever. But that's what he did. All right, we'll stop there. Lord willing, we'll finish this little section, and then we'll take up with 1 Thessalonians. Thank you very much.